Hello and welcome to chapter 3 of JavaScript. So in this chapter we're going to talk about how to store data in arrays, when and where to use do-while loops, do-while statements, for loops, continue statements to restart looping statements, and if statements. If statements are normally our decision structures. They kind of get us from point A to point B. They help the computer to actually make decisions. Those are the things we'll go into more than others. So let's start it off. So let's talk about arrays. An array is a set of data that represents a single variable name. So think of an array as a position, or moreover, think of an array as a box that has different segments in the box. So you have a big box, and in that box you can put many different things. And each thing you put in the box has a specific place or a specific position. That position or that place has a specific name. Normally, when we talk about arrays, we're talking about something that's got a position number. So the first object that you put into an array, or the first thing that you put into your box, would go into the first position, or the 0th position. The second thing would go into the first position, and so on and so forth. In computer science, we count from 0 first, not 1. So in this case, you have the array name, new sections. See if I can get my pen up. You have the array name, new sections, and you have the array data. And each of these array data would have a specific position in the array. Theoretically speaking, if I started with world, this would sit in position 0, local would sit in position 1, opinion would sit in position 2, and sports would sit in position 3. Now, think about it from this perspective. When you're looking at your array data has a specific data type and sits in the array in a specific position. So the array position 0 contains the literal string world. And this is kind of a conceptual illustration of what an array would actually contain. So an array literal is the most common way to create an array, and it declares a variable and specifies the array as content. So for instance, var name, as we would describe a variable or initialize a variable, we would say var name, or var the name of my array, equals, and these brackets define that we have an array. Now, there are certain situations where you would already know what goes into your array. There are other situations where you wouldn't already know what would go into your array. So let's take this array at the bottom here, var new sections. When we looked at the previous slide, var new sections was the name of the array, and the array data was world, local, opinion, and sports. Now looking at it from the perspective of the syntax in JavaScript, you have your var new sections, which is the name of your array, brackets, and then you have the name of each object as it exists in the array in the position that it would exist. So let's switch over for a second to our code screen, and let's look at this for a second. So var new sections equals, and then we'll put our array values in there. So we have world, local, opinion, if I don't mess that up, and sports. Now, if I wanted to call something from this array, and I'll run this real quick so that we have nothing here. If I wanted to get the string sports from this array, I would have to call the array and then in brackets call the position that sports exists in. So in this case, the 3rd position. Now obviously I want to see that, so I'm going to alert myself to that. If I can type. And then I'm going to run this. And I should get sports. Sports sits in the 3rd position in the array. World sits in the 0th position, local in the 1st position, and opinion in the 2nd position. And this can go on to infinity. Now arrays are really nice when you want to pull data very quickly without having to go out and get it from another source, i.e. a database or a REST call. Or you can take the database, REST call, or however you're getting your information and post it into an array. Normally, when you get something back from REST via JSON, it comes in the form of an array, or more specifically, in the form of a hash table. Hash tables are a little more succinct in the way that they work. And I don't know if we're going to talk about that in this chapter, but they're one of my favorite data types or data objects that you can use. So let's switch back. Now, an element is a piece of data contained in the array. Now, normally when you talk about the data of an array, you'll call it an element. Normally, when I talk about where the data is in the array, I will refer to its position. However, the actual term for the position of an element in an array is its index. An indexing always starts at 0. This is based on the binary principle of lambda expressions. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but for the most part, when you learn arithmetic in elementary school, normally you start at the number 1. Well, based on the way that algebraic expressions work, calculus and those things, actually, you start at the number 0, and you count up from 0. So, as I said before, world is not in the first position in the array, it's in the 0th position, or position 0. Reference elements using its index numbers, as I showed you. So you will call the actual array name, and then you'll call the indexed position of the element in the array. In this case, I wanted to pull sports, so I called the third position in the index. And they have an example here of what I actually did. They're calling the second element in the array, or the element that's in the first position. Don't get too hung up on the numbers. Just understand that everything starts at 0. And that's why I am reiterating the first position, 0th position, second position. Because really, we don't care about what second or third or fourth. We really care about where the position is. Once we understand the positioning, then we can write that syntactically and send it to the computer to get back what we want. So if you want to assign a value to the array without actually, outside of the initializing of the array, you will take the name of the array, the position you would like that specific element to exist, and fill that position with the data. So in this case, you have the name of the array, new sections, and then you have the indexed position, which is position 4, or the 5th element, and that's kind of funny, by the way, I said that on purpose. And I'm going to fill that 4th position with the literal string entertainment. And I can test that for you to prove to you that that actually works. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to say new sections, and then I'll say 4, and then I'll say entertainment. And then I will call it to see if it actually initialized and filled that position with the element. That's interesting. Did I spell something wrong? I did. And there you go, entertainment. Syntax is a big deal. This is why I don't like doing these these capitalizations. All scripting languages are recommended heavily for nothing but lowercase. But even so, old school camel case exists for some reason. Alright, let's go to the next slide. So you can create an array without elements, and this is normally what we do. We don't normally assign elements to an array when we create it, and the reason why is because we like our arrays to be dynamic. So in this case, we're creating the array colors and then using the brackets to define that it's going to be an array. Then I'm filling that array, or the second position in the array, with the literal string yellow. JavaScript values assigned to array elements can be different data types. So in the case of C#, Java, or strongly typed languages, you can't put different data types in the same array. However, in JavaScript you can. And it looks something like this. I'll call this diff data, and we'll keep world. We'll do the letter number 1, we'll keep opinion, and we'll do the number 2.5767, blah, blah, blah. And then I'll have another data type true. So we have 3 different data types here. We have a literal string in world and opinion. We have an integer in the number 1. We have a float in the number 2.567. And we have a Boolean value of true as well. Now let's see if this is going to run correctly. I want to call diff data, and we'll do an alert. We'll do something cheeky. Document.get element by ID main inner HTML equals diff data, and we're going to call the third position. Let's see what we get. Will it run? Will it give us errors? Would you look at that? It gave us the float. That means that everything ran just fine. Now, in strongly typed languages like C#, Java, C++, and the like, you can't do this. And the reason why is because when you pass the value of the object, you also have to pass the data type of the object. And the data type has to be continuous throughout the array. So, and this isn't in C#, so obviously it's not going to work, but I'll write it to you the way it would be written in C#. If I wanted a string array, I would have to write string array, the name of the array, and then new string array, and I would have to define the amount of positions I would have in that array. That's how you would write it in C#. And it's mainly the same in Java. If I wanted an integer array, or an int array, I would call it int array. And the reason why is because everything that can go into this array has to be of the integer data type. If you want to have a dynamic array, the way that we have right here with diff data in JavaScript, I would have to use lists. I would have to use lists in C# as well as Java in order to have different data types in the same object, if you will, that acts like an array. But JavaScript doesn't have that constraint. You can have an array that has got different data types. In this case, we have 4 different data types here. We have string, integer, float, and Boolean. And if I change this, I will get a different value from JavaScript. Now, once JavaScript prints this, and this is basically what it's doing, when it writes this into the HTML, it converts all of it to a string. So really, it doesn't care what data type it is. It knows what it has to be when it comes out. All right, let's switch back. To access an element's value, you include the brackets. So in this case, we have get element by ID section 1, section 2, section 3. We can then, now what this is doing is, it's taking the element that has the ID section 1, and it's loading it or initializing the variable sec1 head with whatever that element is. So if it's a div, it's going to place that div in this variable. If it's a p tag, it's going to place that in here. Whatever this is, whatever this ID is associated with, it's going to place it inside sec1 head. Wherever I call sec1 head, I'm calling whatever the object is associated with this ID. And then what I'm saying is, whatever the element position 0 is in new sections array, I want you to write that to whatever the tag is for sec1 head. How does that work? Well, if I switch over, I have div main here. Let's say I took, instead of doing this, I said I wanted to match the slide. Let's say I wanted to var main equals document dot element by ID, and then we'll say main. Now that I did that, when I run this, and I can do main dot inner HTML equals main. So I want to see what's in the variable main, and I'm going to write it to this div right here. It should show up here in the HTML element. And there you go. What is in this main variable when I did this? So var main equals document.get element by ID literal string main. What this literally is doing, it's finding the ID in the HTML with this name, this literal string main, and it's taking that object and it's placing it in this variable. Now, whenever I call this variable, I'm literally calling this div. I'm referencing that div. So now I can do whatever I want with it. So in this case, I say that div which is the variable main dot inner HTML main, or whatever is on this side of the expression. I want you to write it. That's what inner HTML does. I want you to write it to this HTML element that exists in this variable. So in this case, if I said diff data, 1, because we haven't done that one yet, and I ran it, I should get diff data's indexed position, the first position, and it will write it to whatever the tag that exists in main is, which is, in this case, is div id equals main. And that's what that really means. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the element id that exists for section 1. I'm loading it into sec1 head. The variable sec1 head, sec2 head is section 2, whatever the case may be. Then I'm taking this variable and I am substituting this variable for document.getElementById. Basically, this variable is doing exactly what document.getElementId is doing. The difference is it already contains it, so it's faster. So then I say sec1 head dot inner HTML write something, or write HTML to whatever the element is, or the tag of sec1 head, and that information will be whatever exists in the 0th position of new sections array, which in this case is world. In my case, it was diff data 1, which was the number 1. So if you want to modify the value that's in a specific position in the array, you'll do the same exact thing as if you wanted to add more data to the array. So in this case, the 4th position of new sections already contains a value, what we're doing, and I think the value was entertainment if I'm not mistaken. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm taking the literal string living and I'm replacing entertainment in new sections at the 4th position. It kind of works the same as a variable. Once I replace that specific position or that element at that position, it is gone forever. I can't bring it back. So when I do replace it with living, I need to make sure that's exactly what I want. If I want living to be a temporary holder in the 4th position, then I need to create another array or find a way to make it to where I don't lose the value that's already there. I just have 2 values in 2 separate arrays, or whatever the case may be. Just remember that once you change the value of an array element, you cannot change it back unless you expressly or implicitly do it in your code. So the length property. So if you want to find out if an array is empty, you use the length property. The length property actually will tell you how many objects exist, how many elements exist in the array. So let's switch over to code screen for a second. Let's look at that. So we'll erase this for a sec. We have diff data. Diff data has 5 elements. So if I did main, I should have done that, huh? If I did main.innerHTML.length, I should get the number 5. And I do, because there are 5 elements in the array. Now, what if there were no elements in the array? So let's say we said empty array, and we'll initialize it with nothing in it. And then I said, I want to find out what's in empty array. So empty array dot length should be 0. And it is. Now, why would I want to know how many things are in an array? Well, there are situations where you want to find out if something is empty or if something is null. So in most instances, if you wanted to add something to the array, but you want to make sure the array has nothing, you will say something along these lines. If empty array dot length equals 0, alert load things into the array. And if I wanted to actually load things into the array, I would say, I could say, not would say, empty array equals diff data. And then I could say main.innerHTML equals empty array. Now, that's not going to work because it's not going to print the array. Let's say what empty array to see if there's something in the 0th position. So I'm saying if empty array.length is 0, I want you to copy diff data to empty array and then tell me what's at the 0th position. And I got world. And the reason why is because world exists here in the 0th position in diff data, and that's what I'm copying to empty array if empty array length was 0. Now this won't work anymore because it's not 0. Well, that's not true. It will always be 0 until I initialize something into it. Every time I refresh this, it'll be 0. So, never mind. Let's switch back. Okay, so JavaScript represents arrays with the array object, right? There's a special constructor for arrays. Normally we don't talk about constructors in JavaScript because it's not necessarily imperative that we use it, but we can. If we wanted to initialize a variable as an array, using the array JavaScript with specific positions, we could. The same way I showed you the way it happens in C#. But it's easier to do array literals because there's 2 reasons why. One, because we can have a dynamic array that is as big or as small as we want it to be, and number 2, it's not a fixed array. In this case, it would be a fixed array. So the brackets is a array literal. This is an array object. So getElement by tag name is a very interesting way of grabbing a tag from HTML without knowing the ID. So let's switch over for a second so I can show you what I'm talking about. Let's erase this. And let's say, no, let's not erase it all. Let's erase the empty array part. And let's say document, instead of, actually let's put that back. Empty array.length because I want that. Let's say getElement by tag name, and I'm going to say div. And let's see what happens. Nothing. Main dot getElement elements by tag name. Maybe I have to be more specific. That's interesting. I don't ever use getElements by tag name for the mere fact that it doesn't work all the time. It can be a bit finicky. As a matter of fact, let's see if it even... Well, let's see what main has inside it. For a second. Nothing. Ah, I see what the problem is. I am calling the variable div and not I am the smartest. Alright, it should work now. Says no one. Put the index back. Still doesn't work. Why, good sir? Why you do this thing? Doesn't like it for some reason. So we normally use getElement by ID because it works all the time in all browsers. I've noticed that getElements by tag name is not as specific, and I could just be doing something incorrect, but for the most part, what getElement by tag name does is it grabs the tag name. And if you have more than one of those tag names, so for instance, if I said li, as it does in the li stuff, no stuff, and I said run, and then I said I want to grab li, I want to grab the second li, and I said run, it would tell me it probably doesn't understand. So let's let's console this for a second. Let's find out what's going on. Yep, getElement by tag name. It's not a function. Can I erase all this? Run. Get element by tag name is not a function at window.onload. There you go. So either I'm writing this wrong, which I can possibly check right now. Give me 1 second. I just want to make sure I'm not writing this incorrectly. Maybe that's the issue? No, it's not. One more thing. I'm going to try one more thing and then I'm going to drop it. Could be. Well, it worked on the W3 schools. I don't understand why it's not working here. Get elements. Get elements. There we go. I messed up. Oh man, I had a brain fart and a half there. Alright, good to go. So I just fat fingered it. That was the problem. Whew. Sorry, those kind of things really they can really be an issue. Either way, so let's go back to our code for a sec. So I spelled it wrong. It was get elements by tag name. Now I have both LIs that exist in main. Now I have to define which one I want. So I'll say main one dot, I guess I could say value. No, that's not going to work. I think I have to say inner HTML. Maybe. Let me see the example that I was just playing with. Main.inner HTML equals. Oh, that's hilarious. I'm calling main twice. I should say not main. I should say li, and then I should say var main equals get element by id main, and then run this. What did I do wrong this time? Li is where they are. Run, and there it is. Okay, so what did I just do? I took the document.get elements by tag name li, and I placed it in the variable li. Well, what that essentially did was it created an array. The reason why it created an array instead of a variable is because there were two list items. If there was only one list item, it probably would not have done that. It probably would have just saved it as, I say probably because I don't know if that's true or not. But I know for a fact that because there's more than one li, it will only display, it will create an array. If I said li.innerHTML, it will print undefined because it doesn't know what I want. So I have to tell it what position in the array it wants. And right now I said I wanted the first position. And therefore what it did was I then said I want you to print that to the main div. So I took this HTML, inner HTML, and I printed it to that div using inner HTML. I basically said I wanted the inner HTML of li in the first position to be the inner HTML of the main div. And that's how that worked. But get elements by tag name works just like get element by ID. Elements by tag name would require an S. That's why I was having an issue. And it does work, so I stand corrected. I had to do some research to find out what I was doing wrong there. Back to the PowerPoint screen. So what are loop statements? Loop statements are control flow statements that repeatedly execute. This is a very interesting way of defining what's called iterative loops. Iterative loops are loops that iterate. That's it. Depending on the amount of things that are in a specific object. So in this case, they only talk about while loops, do while loops, and for loops. But there's also for each. And for each kind of defeats the purpose of using for statements. We'll get into that as we move forward, but you'll find that for each loops are a lot nicer than for statements, even though they're not as fast. So what's a while statement? A while statement is basically a statement that repeats itself or iterates as long as a specific conditional expression is true. So while this expression is true, do stuffs. And it'll keep repeating over and over and over again. Now, this is nice for when you want a user to input values until the user doesn't want to input values anymore. Or I guess that would actually be a while. Well, you can do and while for both. But in a sense, you would write that do while or while loop to operate over and over and over again until something is true. Or the while loop operates while the condition is true. Once the condition is proven false, it will no longer iterate. While loops don't have counters. So if you want to count the amount of times that the loop is gone, you have to create your own counter inside the loop. There's probably reasons for why you would do that. I don't really see a whole lot of while or do while loops out there, to be honest, because in most situations you try to not have iterative loops in your code. You want to shy away from that as much as you possibly can. It can be very hard on your processor cycles. So I use iterative loops all the time, but there's a method to the madness. So here's an example of a while loop. So they have the var, the variable counter. Remember I told you they don't count. So you have to do the count yourself. Variable count is being initialized, or the variable count is initialized here with the number 1. While count is less than or equal to the number 5, I want you to write the number, and I want you to break the line, and then I want you to increment the value of count by 1. When this while loop completes itself, then I want you to write, you have printed 5 numbers. And yes, this works. I'm not going to write it. It's here. If you want to write it and test it, you can. But for the most part, that works. And there may be situations where a while loop is important. I just can't think of one right now to use as an example. So while loops can work backwards as well. So in this case, var count and the number is 10. While the count is greater than 0, I want you to write the variable count into the HTML. I want you to break line, and then I want you to decrement the count integer by 1. Once this while loop is complete, I want you to write this into your page. There is another situation where you have the variable count being initialized to the number 1, and while the variable count is less than or equal to 100, I want you to write the value of the variable count concatenated with a break line, and then I want you to multiply by 2 the value in the variable count. And as you can see, 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8, and so on and so forth, until the value of count is greater than 100, or equal to 100, because 2 times 64 is 128. So what's an infinite loop? An infinite loop is pretty much the bane of your existence. It's a loop that never ends. It'll never be false, especially in a situation where you're not paying attention to what you're doing. You can pretty much catch your computer on fire if you do this. I'm joking, but you could break a lot of things by creating infinite loops. So in this case, the loop is built correctly. Variable count is initialized to the number 1. Now obviously this expression with a counter, you don't have to use that all the time. It could be something completely different than a counter. The expression in the while loop can be when the user hits the key, press enter. Then I want you to leave the loop. It doesn't have to be this, but for the sake of this, we're using a counter. So while the count is less than or equal to 10, I want you to tell me what the number count is. And this will go over and over again. As a matter of fact, I will write this one so you can see what it actually does. So let's comment all this code out for a sec, because I don't know if I'm going to need it later. And let's write this infinite loop. While count is less than or equal to 10. I'm not going to do window.alert. I'm going to say document. No, I'm not going to do windows.alert. I'm going to say main.innerHTML equals count equals the number is the value of count concatenated with, and then let's run it. Now notice, wait a minute, I goofed. Let's do that. Better. Better? No, not better. Better. Not better. Oh, I see what I did wrong. Tisk, tisk. And then if I run that, it'll probably be really pissed off. I can't even get it to go to console. It's not even going to console. It's stuck. I think I just broke it. Obviously, this is what the infinite loops do. They break stuff. I'm actually hitting F12 right now. If I said, yep, I'm right clicking, nothing. I'm gonna close JS Fiddle. Let's go back to JS Fiddle. And this time, let's not do what we just did. Close. So, yeah, that's what infinite loops do. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to just, I don't know, do it one more time, right? So I can just show you what's happening. If it'll show me what's happening, it might not. It might just go blah. No. And we'll do console.log so you see it in the log screen. So plus count plus that, and then run it. You see that number? 1242, 4,282, 3,992. It's still writing it. It's still writing the number. Look, it'll keep writing it over and over and over again. I hope you can see that. That number is at 45,000. It will never stop. And I will more than likely not be able to do anything in the page. The page is pretty much dead because it's still writing the number is 1, the number is 1, the number is 1, because you didn't iterate. You didn't tell it when to stop. You didn't iterate the count number to 10. I think it'll probably be at 50,000. Yep. It'll just keep going. So we're going to not do that. Good thing I have a pretty beefy computer. Stop, please. Thank you. All right. So that is what an infinite loop looks like, and that is what an infinite loop does. So please don't do that to your computer. I don't know if your computer can take it, but you might get the blue screen of death. I have a pretty beefy computer, an i7, blah, blah, blah. So it won't die. Well, it shouldn't die. I'll call Intel if it does. Tell them to send me a new processor. But infinite loops are bad. Like I said, they can catch your computer on fire. That's a joke, but it's not a joke for individuals who have servers that are doing a lot of things. You accidentally write an infinite loop into your code. It gets deployed to the web server, and you bring it down. That can be a really bad situation. So be wary of loops. especially iterative loops like while loops, where there is no end to the loop. This is why I don't like while loops or loops that require me to count. I would rather do a for each loop, and I will go over what that is later if I get the opportunity. So, assigning an array element values to table cells. Obviously, this is another while loop that assigns values to the table header tag, and it's basically the days of the week. And apparently, there's an array called days of the week. Now, the way this is working is that for each... Now, I don't understand why they did while here. They could have done for. They would have done the same thing. And you don't have to initialize the variable I. It's initializing the parameters. But the variable I, or index, that's really what it stands for, equals 0. While I is less than 7, which is 7 days of the week, I want you to grab the table headers. I want you to use the index I number. So here it will be 0 to start. Inner HTML equals, and that's the 0th th. So there should be 7 ths. And then the first or the 0th th inner HTML equals days of the week 0. Because I is 0 here. I want you to increment I by 1, and then while I is less than 7, do it again. So the next time it iterates, it'll be I equals 1, right? Because it's going to iterate again. And then this is going to happen all over again. So document.element by tag name th1, because the I is 1 now, .inner HTML equals days of the week 1. So you'll get Monday. And then increment I by 1. Now this is 2. While I get the picture, and it'll keep going until it gets to the 7th number, or when I equals, or I is equals 7, it'll stop. So, and at that point, you'll have all the days of the week written into the table headers. Once again, I'm not going to write that in JSFill. If you want to write that, you can. But this actually does work. I don't understand why they use the while loop. You can use a for loop and do the same thing. You can use a for each loop. I'm going to keep saying that until I show you what it is. Alright, so a do while statement executes a statement or statements once, then repeats the execution as long as a given condition, expression, evaluates to a true value. So while loops, the expression is done at the beginning of the loop. A do while loop, the expression is evaluated at the end of the loop. So do something while the expression is true. A while loop is while the expression is true, do something. Now there are situations where you want the expression to be evaluated first before you do anything. There's other situations where you don't want the expression to be evaluated first before it does something. So you do something, and then while this is true, do it again. Whereas the while loop doesn't do anything until it evaluates the expression, and then it does something. That is the difference between a do while and a while loop. I'll say it again. A while loop evaluates the expression before the statements are written. If the expression is not true, the statements will never be run. In a do while loop, the statements are run first. Then the expression is evaluated to see if it's true. If the evaluated expression is true, run the statement again. Keep running the statement until the evaluated expression is false. That's the way a do while loop works. And that's the only difference, really the biggest difference between the two. I wouldn't say only difference, it's the biggest difference between the two. So here's an example of a do while loop. Now, you have var count, because once again, do while loops and while loops don't do their own counting. They cannot iterate counters. So you can see how it's doing something, then it's evaluating the expression. In the while loop, it evaluates whether the count is less than 2. Then it does something. That's the difference. So, adding the days of the week. So, I is equal to 0. Do days of the week while I is less than 7. So, let's say I was not less than 7 after the first iteration. So, it iterates once, it goes and does its thing, and then it realizes I is already 7. Okay, at that point, I'm going to stop iterating through the do while. But it would have done the first th. So you should get 1 th. That's the way a do-while loop works. If this was a while loop, it would have never iterated at all. It would have just said, oh, I already equals 7. I'm not going to run the statement. So, my favorite, next to for each, is a for loop. And the reason why I like for loops is because you can get real specific with for loops, especially in your parameters. So let's jump right into it. I'm just gonna go boop boop. That's good for your quiz, but I want to get to this part. This is the meat and potatoes right here. This is the part that I really care about right here. The for loop has 3 parameters. Okay, the for loop has, and like I'm not Xing this out because it's not important. It's important, but I'm not going to go over it. It literally, a for loop is an iterative loop. That's what it is. It iterates through objects like arrays. Okay, so the first parameter of the for loop is a counter declaration. That is, I'm initializing the index, the I. Remember when I said do whiles and whiles don't count their own loops? For loops count their own loops. It's really nice. So in the parameter for the for loop, you have a variable I. You declare that counter. I equals whatever number you want it to equal. I equals 0, I equals 1, I equals 10, whatever. I equals negative 50. Then your condition. While I is less than 10. While I is greater than 50. While I is blah, 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 blah. And then what happens at the end of each loop? What happens at the end of each iteration? So while I is equal to 0, I'm sorry, variable I equals 0. While variable I is less than 10. And then at the end of the loop, I want you to iterate the I one time. I++. And then I'll have my statements in the middle. And as it iterates, it'll iterate these statements over and over and over again. Now, why are for loops so nice? Why do programmers like for loops so much? Why are developers in love with for loops? Because I don't have to write the same thing 10 times. I can just say, for the amount that I want you to iterate. And it's all compact. I don't have to initialize a variable outside of my do while. I don't have to count the variable in my do while. It's already being done in the parameters. Everything you saw us doing in the do while loop, the extra stuff, the var count, the count plus plus in the statement, I don't have to do that with a for loop. I just write it straight into the parameters and it gives me exactly what I want. So, this is the way it works. We just talked about this. Counter variable declared initialized. The for loop condition is evaluated. If the condition in step 2 returns a truly value, the for loop statements execute. If it returns a false value, the for loop ends. And it updates if there's an update statement for the for statement that's executed. This is really detailed. This is a very good slide to have. I think that this information might be important for your quizzes, but for the most part, I literally just said this. So, here's a for loop. Literally, one line of code. Very compact. You saw how many lines of code the do whiles were. This is not that many. You have an array, bright as stars. And then and it said count, but normally it's I. So for count equals 0, so var count equals 0. While count is less than the length of the array bright as stars. We talked about length. Length is the amount of elements that is in an array. It'll count the amount of elements. So this number will be the amount of elements in the array. I want you to, at the end of the array, increment the index count by 1. And for each iteration, I want you to write the value of the array position in the HTML. That's it. This is a very compact way to do an iterative loop. It is probably the most efficient way to do an iterative loop in today's programming paradigms. Still, it's been that way for years, and it still is that way. So, a for statement is more efficient than a while statement. I just got finished explaining that to you. Let's count the lines together. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines, and counting the end bracket, that's 5 lines. With a for loop, we have 1 line, 2 lines, and then counting the end bracket, that's 3 lines. By proxy, the less amount of lines that I have, the faster something will be. Moreover, because the for loop has the parameters overloading it with what you already need, you don't have to explicitly initialize variables you'll never use, or initialize variables globally, not that you'll never use. I can initialize a variable internal to the for loop, and it goes away when the for loop is finished. This variable will not go away when the do while loop is finished. That variable will still exist in memory unless I get rid of it. So little things like that can be speed decrements to your browser. In the end, for loops are way more efficient than do while loops. Do while loops are necessary for certain operations, but I haven't used do while loops in a very long time because for loops and for each loops are far more efficient. So here goes a for loop that we were doing in the do while, we did in the while. We want to add the column headers, and we want to do it based on the amount of the days of the week that are in the array days of week. Now notice this is actually broken into 2 lines because it's long, but literally 1, 2, 3 lines. That is as many lines as that for loop needs. This is all 1 line, by the way. It's just broken because it's a very long line. It wouldn't have fit. It would not have fit on this slide. So, a continue statement halts a looping statement, and it restarts the loop with a new iteration. So, in a for loop, let's just go to the example. In a for loop, the continue statement will work based on a decision structure. Or, it doesn't have to be, but it can be. So, we're initializing the variable count to 1. We're saying while count is less than or equal to 5, and then at the end of the for loop, or iteration of a for loop, I want you to increment it by 1. If the count and the count type is the number 3, the integer 3, I want you to continue this loop using continue statements to restart the execution. What it will essentially do is it won't go through the rest of the loop. What it will do is it will stop and go to the next iteration. Notice there's no 3 here. It didn't run document.write because once it got to count strongly typed equals 3, strictly typed equals 3, it saw continue and said, okay, I'm just going to skip this loop and go to the next one. That's what that does. So decision-making statements, decision-making structures, or conditional statements are special types of JavaScript statements used for making decisions. Wrong. Actually, decision-making statements, decision-making structures, or conditional statements are special types of programming statements. These same statements you see in JavaScript are the same statements you will see in Java, C#, C++. They might be implemented slightly different, but they're the same. These are paradigms that transcend languages. Perl had it, JavaScript has it, PHP has it in its own way. All of it. They all have these decision structures. They're all available. And the same efficiencies remain. For loops are more efficient than any other iterative loop you can use. Iterative loops, in the main scheme of things, is not the greatest when it comes to, processor cycles and things of that nature, but very efficient when it comes to looping through items that you yourself don't want to write over and over again, or items which can be dynamic. Just remember, this right here is true for JavaScript, but it's true for all languages as well. Knowing these decision structures is important in all programming languages, not just JavaScript. The if statement is the most common type of decision-making statement, next to case statements. If statements and case statements are synonymous, really. So, as you already know, an if then else, if then else if, is a statement that executes based on 2 conditions, or 1 condition. If the condition is true, it'll execute the statement that's within the bowels of the if statement. If the condition is false, it won't execute this statement and it'll go to the next line. Very simple. You can use a command block to construct a decision-making structure containing multiple statements. So, if the expression is true, execute this statement. However, if the expression is false, then execute that statement. Now, you can write an if statement without an else clause. It'll just go to the next functional statement. However, in this case, there's an else clause here. Therefore, if this expression is not true, then I want you, or actually I'm not writing that correctly. Let's do it this way. If this expression is not true, then I want you to execute the else. That's the way that works. So, var today equals Tuesday. If today, the variable today, equals the string literal Monday and is a string, remember, 3 equal signs is a strict equality, which means that I'm not only looking to see if the value of the variable is the same, I'm also looking to see if the data type of the variable is the same. If both of those are the same, 3 equal signs, then execute what's in the middle here. However, if either of those are not the same, whether it's the data type or the value Monday, then I want you to execute today is not Monday. Which one do you think is going to execute? You are correct if you said that the else would execute, because the value of the variable today is Tuesday. So when this runs, it's not going to be equal to strict type today. Therefore, the else statement will execute. So nested decision-making structures are if statements within if statements. That's basically all it is. And it is there's an instance where you would do that. I actually just did that in my code, where I had a if statement within an if statement. As a matter of fact, can I find that? I might not be able to find it. I think it's in my other... I wrote this in 2 different places, and I think I removed it because I didn't need it. Either way. But there are situations where you would have an if statement within an if statement. Those are called nested ifs. You can also have an if statement, an if-else statement within an if-else statement. Or an if statement within an if-else, or an if-else within an if, blah, blah, blah. So here goes a situation where that happens. The sales total variable equals 75. If sales total is greater than 50, but if sales total, and then there's another if statement here, if sales total is less than 100, I want you to write the sales total is between 50 and 100. Now, some of you may be asking, is there a more efficient way to do this? And by Jove, there is. I'm wondering if the next slide would tell us that. Now, you can write a... Okay, let me go back for a second and talk about this. So, in this condition, you have a Boolean expression. The Boolean expression will return whether it's true or false. Period. It doesn't return anything other than true or false. So with that in mind, you can actually place both of these Boolean expressions in the same if line, in the same if condition, to get the same result that you got here in this nested if sales total is greater than 50, if sales total is less than 100. You can do the same thing. However, you don't need to use 2 different if statements. You can. There are situations where you do, but in this situation, you don't really have to. And I hope that it shows you that. It didn't. Let me go back. I'll show you then. Let's talk about it. Code screen. So we have this if statement, and we'll write it out. Var sales total equals 75 if sales total is greater than 50. Ooh, I can do the typing. And if sales total is less than 100, because that's really what that says, I want you to write some stuff. So let's do that. Remember that when you're writing a string, if you put it on 2 different lines, you have to concatenate them. If you do not, it will not write correctly. And let's run that and see what happens. The sales total is between 50 and 100. So it wrote, I don't know if you can see that. As a matter of fact, what I should do is say p style color white. There we go. I just added an inline CSS style for those of you who are not HTTP or HTML savvy, so you can see it. The sales total is between 50 and 100. Okay, but can I be more efficient? Do I need two if statements to do this? No, I do not. I could say if sales total is greater than 50 and sales total is less than 100, would that do the same thing? It did. The sales total is between 50 and 100. If this was not between 50 and 100, let's say it was 49, I wouldn't get anything. Now, why does that work? Because what I'm doing is I'm taking both Boolean expressions and I'm running the condition as one big condition. Now, you can look at both of these Boolean expressions as separate expressions unto themselves. So, in a sense, what I should have done was put both of these expressions in parentheses, because that's exactly what the program is doing, putting them both in parentheses and executing them separately. It first checks to see if the sales total is greater than 50. Then it checks to see that the sales total is less than 100. Now, both of those values have to be true in order for this to work, because I'm using the Boolean expression and. If I use the Boolean expression or, in this case that's or, either it's less than 50 or greater than 100, only one of the Boolean expressions needs to be true in order for the statement to execute. So in this case, let's kind of change this around to make it make a little more sense. If sales total is less than 50, but greater than 100. Right now, it's less than 50. Will this execute? Yes, it will. It's not greater than 100, but it is less than 50. Because one of these Boolean expressions was true, because I have the or moniker in the middle, the or Boolean expression in the middle, Boolean operator, it will operate. It will execute. So, if this is and this is something that I feel strongly about to tell you right now, if there's and in between the Boolean expressions, both of the conditions must be true. Well, it's one big condition, but both of the Boolean expressions must be true. If it's an or in the middle, only one expression needs to be true in order to execute the middle of this code. All right, let's get back to the chapter. So, nested if statement. If game location, and once again, this is a strict equal sign. So away has to be a literal string, and away has to be the value that exists within the game location of index. Then write that with the @ sign. Else, if blah 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 blah. Now, you don't have to say else and then if. You can actually just say else if. And you can write an actual condition in the else if statement. As a matter of fact, you can have many else ifs. You can have if, else if, else if, else if, else if, from here to kingdom come if you wanted to. That would be a pain in the butt to write and a pain in the butt to change, but you could. So what's a backwards compatible event listener? A backwards compatible event listener is a listener that goes back and it binds itself to an object. And it binds itself to the object in order to do something. In this case, you were checking the submit button. So right now, let's go one by one, right? So the variable submit button is initialized here. Document.getElementById button means that the button ID or the tag with the button ID associated with it is going to get placed into the variable submit button. So now submit button is the element that contains the ID button. I'm going to check submit button to see if there's an event listener already associated with it. If there is an event listener already associated with it, what I want to do is I want to tell that event listener that you are now a click event listener. And you're going to submit, or when this is clicked, you're going to run the function submit form. If there is a attach event method associated with the submit button, then you will do the same thing with attach event. They're both, and the reason why. So you might be asking, why is attach event here over add event listener? The reason why is because add event listener works with all browsers that are IE 9 or higher. Attach event works with all browsers that are IE 8 or lower. So basically, you're doing a catch-all here. If add event listener exists in the element based on what browser you're using, then I want you to use that. However, if attach event is the function or method being associated with the element that you called, then I want you to use attach event. It's just a check for the browser that you're using. Most modern day browsers use add event listener, but there are the one-offs that still have IE8 or below, and they will only use attach event. So controls, switch statements. We talked about I was alluded to case statements. Case statements are the most efficient decision structure you could use, because case statements look at a value and evaluates if that value is true, but it looks at the value async, not in a synchronous manner. So it makes more sense if you actually see it. So here's a switch. We have our switch caller or call and our expression. The expression is literally the same as a condition in an if statement. So in this case, it can be switch, and then the expression can be a value of a variable. And then if the variable, so let's say this variable is like x, if it equals 1, do something. If it equals 2, do something. If it equals 3, do something. And so on and so forth until the switch statement is complete. And then you'll have your default statement at the end if the expression is null or default or whatever the case may be. The default executes when the value returned by the switch statement expression does not match the case label. And this is important, by the way, when a switch statement executes, a value returned by the expression is compared to each case label. The break statement ends the execution of a switch statement, and it should be the final statement after each case label. And this is what it would look like if you had multiple switches. I use switches all the time. I love them. They're amazing. In this case, we've overloaded the function city location with the parameter American city. Based on the American city that's written in the overload, I want you to not iterate, but look through the switch for that specific case and return the state that it's associated with. And then I want you to write that. So in this case, city location with the overload or argument Boston will return the case Massachusetts. And there's all your breaks in your switch to denote when a case statement has ended. So, in summary, we learned about arrays. And arrays are a collection of elements that exist in positions in the array. The array can be accessed using indexes that are put at the end of the array when you call the array. So in the case that we used in the beginning of this chapter, new sections, you can use the brackets and then call the position you would like, and then get whatever element exists in that array, or in that element, in that position. The length property tells us how many objects or elements are in the array. Remember, arrays in JavaScript, you can put any data type in an array in JavaScript. It doesn't have to necessarily be the same data type. In Java, in C#, in C++, C, and the like, in the higher level languages, you have to tell the array what data type it's going to be. And you can only put that specific type of data in that array. In JavaScript, it's not like that. It's a dynamic array. You can put any data type in the array, and the array does not have to be a fixed position when it's initialized, when it's instantiated. Not instantiated, when it's initialized. It can be 0, and you can dynamically add whatever you want to it after the fact. We also learned about loop statements. We learned about while statements, where the expression is tested before the statements run. We spoke about the do while statement, where the expression is executed before the expression, where the statement is executed before the expression is tested. And then after the expression is tested, if the expression is true, it will execute until the expression is false. Whereas in a while statement, the expression will be tested first, and if the expression is true, the statement will run. Thereby ending the statement, the while statement expression will be tested again. If the statement is true, it will iterate through the statement again. If the expression is false, it will end the while statement. We also spoke about for loops. Now, for loops are extremely efficient, and they're probably the easiest way to create your iterative loops. The for loops have a lot of things going for them. They already have a built-in counter, they already have a built-in condition system, and they already have a built-in method for iterating your counter, whereas in while and do-while loops, you don't. And in most situations, in a while and a do-while loop, because those counters aren't available and because those parameters don't exist, it makes the for statements a lot more efficient, a lot faster, and a lot easier for the computer to actually iterate through. If you can avoid using an iterative loop in your code, do so. SQL DBAs, SQL developers, network engineers, systems engineers will thank you. Iterative loops are the bane of most hardware/data repository engineers' existences because they can cause issues at the computer level and the server level. We went over an infinite loop where the loop never ended. You kind of saw what it did in my browser. Now, I have a pretty beefy box, so it's not really going to bring it down. And I was only running Chrome and OBS on my box, so it's really not going to do that much damage. But let's say you have a bunch of websites or a bunch of MVC apps, or you have a bunch of programs that you're running on a server, and one of your programs decides that you wrote it, but you forgot that you needed a counter. Now it turned into an infinite loop. You can get the blue screen of death pretty fast in that server. That HA that your server is now, or the high availability that it once had, it no longer has. Users don't want to hear that they can't access the things that they need for work or pleasure. So, it's one of those situations where you don't want to find yourself in that situation at all. So if you can, avoid infinite loops at all costs. Iterative loops are amazing. You will use them profusely. Just try to be as efficient with them as you possibly can. Finally, remember that a continue statement restarts the loop with a new iteration, wherever the continue statement is written. That means that it will not complete the statement if it's written in the middle of the statement. It will go through whatever part of the statement the continue statement does not exist, and once the continue statement is interacted, the computer interacts with the continue statement, it will not run the rest of the code in that statement. It will start the loop over again with a new iteration. We spoke about decision making and the way that computers go through their decision making structures at the programming level. The two big decision structures that we talked about, decision making statements that we talked about, were if statements and switch statements. If statements are great, especially if you have a very simple way, if this, then that, if else if, way of trying to get the computer to think about, without being artificially intelligent, think about the decision that it needs to make based on what you want it to filter. So in the case that we used, with a sales total number being a specific value, we asked the computer to run a statement only if the sales value was between two separate values. In the case of the switch statement, it's a little different. You do have an expression or a condition that you would run at the beginning of your switch statement, but then there's a list of case statements within the switch statement that have to be true in order to run. Also understand that once the value of the case is true, that is it. It ends the case statement. There is no else. There is no else if. That is all. A command block is a set of statements contained within a set of braces. Now, you can think of a command block as a function or a method, and that's really what it is. It makes your life a lot easier, and it can make your code a lot more efficient as well. And that's it. If you have any questions or concerns, just let me know, and I'll reach out and I'll give you all the help that you need. Otherwise, have a good one.